This is a reading of Hatchet by Gary Paulsen, Chapter 2. For a time, he could not understand. Brian could do nothing. Even after his mind began working and he could see what had happened, he could do nothing. It was as if his hands and arms were lead. Then he looked away. Then he looked for ways for it not to have happened. Be asleep? His mind screamed at the pilot. Just be asleep and your eyes will open now and your hands will take controls and your feet will move the pedals, but it didn't happen. The pilot did not move, except that his head rolled on a neck impossibly loose as the plane hit a small bit of turbulence. The plane. Somehow the plane was still flying. Seconds had passed, nearly a minute, and the plane flew on as if nothing had happened. And he had to do something. He had to do something, but he didn't know what. Help! He had to help. He stretched one hand toward the pilot, saw that his fingers were trembling, and touched the pilot on the chest. He did not know what to do. He knew there were procedures that you could do mouth to mouth on victims of heart attacks and push their chests, CPR, but he did not know how to do it. And in any case, could not do it with the pilot who was sitting up in the seat and still strapped in with his seatbelt. So he touched the pilot with the tips of his fingers, touched him on the chest and could feel nothing, no heartbeat, no rise and fall of breathing, which meant the pilot was almost certainly dead. Please, Brian said, but didn't know who to ask. Please. The plane lurched again, hit a little more turbulence, and Brian felt the nose dip. It did not dive, but the nose went down slightly and the down angle increased the speed. And he knew that at this angle, the slight angle down, he would ultimately fly into the trees. He could see them ahead on the horizon, where before he could only see sky. He had to fly it somehow. He had to fly the plane. He had to help himself. The pilot was gone, beyond anything he could do. He had to try and fly the plane. He turned back in the seat, facing the front and putting his hands, still trembling, on the control, his feet gently on the rudder pedals. You pull back on the stick to raise the plane. He knew that from reading. You always pull back on the wheel. He gave it a tug and slid it back toward him easily, too easily. The plane, with the increased speed from the tilt down, swooped eagerly up and drove Brian's stomach down. He pushed the wheel back in, went too far this time, and the plane's nose went below the horizon, and the engine speed increased with the shallow dive. Too much. He pulled back again, more gently this time, and the nose floated up again. Too far, but not as violently as before, and then down a bit too much, and then up again before, then down a bit too much, and up again, very easily, and the front of the plane, the front of the engine, cowling, settled. When he aimed it at the horizon and it seemed to be steady, he held the wheel where it was and let out his breath, which he had been holding all this time, and tried to think what to do next. It was a clear blue sky day with fluffy bits of clouds here and there, and he looked out the window for a moment, hoping to see something, a town or a village, but there was nothing, just green of the trees, endless green, and lakes scattered more and more thickly as the plane flew. Where? He was flying, but he didn't know where. He had no idea where he was going. He looked at the dashboard of the plane, studied the dials, and hoped to get some help, hoped to find a compass, but it was also confusing, a jumble of numbers and lights. One lighted display in the top center of the dashboard said the number was 342. Another next to it said 22. Down beneath, there were dials with lines that seemed to indicate what winds were doing, tipping or moving. One dial with a needle pointed to the number 70, which he only thought might be the altimeter, the device that told him his height above the ground or above the sea. Somewhere he had read something about altimeters, but he couldn't remember what or where or anything about them. Slightly to the left and below the altimeter, he saw a small rectangular panel with a lighted dial and two knobs. His eyes had passed it over 2 or 3 times before he saw what was written in tiny letters on top of the panel. Transmitter 221 was stamped in the metal and hit him. Finally, this was the radio. The radio, of course. He had to use the radio. When the pilot had been hit that way, he couldn't bring himself to say the pilot was dead. He couldn't think of it. He had to try to use the radio. Brian looked at the pilot. The headset was still on his head, turned sideways a bit from him, jamming back into the seat, and the microphone switch was clipped into his belt. Brian had to get the headset from the pilot, had to reach over and get the headset from the pilot, or he wouldn't be able to use the radio to call for help. He had to reach over. His hands began trembling again. He did not want to touch the pilot. He did not want to reach for him, but he had to get the radio. He lifted his hands from the wheel just slightly and held them, waiting to see what would happen. The plane flew on normally, smoothly. All right, he thought. Now to do this thing. He turned and reached for the headset, slid it from the pilot's head, one eye on the plane, waiting for it to dive. The headset came easily, but the microphone switch at the pilot's belt was jammed in, and he had to pull it to get it loose. When he pulled, his elbow bumped the wheel and pushed it in, and the plane started down in a shallow dive. Brian grabbed the wheel and pulled it back, too hard again. And the plane went through another series of stomach-wrenching swoops up and down before he could get it under control. When the thing had settled again, he pulled at the mic cord one more and at last jerked the cord free. It took him another second or two to place the headset on his own and position the small microphone tube in front of his mouth. He had seen the pilot use it and seen him depress the switch at his belt. So Brian pushed the switch in and blew into the mic. He heard the sound of his breath in the headset. Hello? Is there anybody listening on this? Hello? He repeated it 2 or 3 times and then waited, but heard nothing except his own breathing. Panic came then. He had been afraid, had been stopped with the terror of what was happening. But now panic came and he began to scream into the microphone, scream over and over. Help! Somebody help me! I'm in this plane and I don't know. And he started to cry with the screams, crying and slamming his hands against the wheel of the plane, causing it to jerk down and then back up. But again, he heard nothing but the sound of his own sobs on the microphone. His own screams mocking him, coming back to his ears. The microphone. Awareness cut him. He had used the CB radio in his uncle's pickup once. You had to turn the mic switch off to hear anybody else. He reached to his belt and released the switch. For a second, all he heard was whoosh of empty airwaves. And then, through the noise and static, he heard a voice. Whoever is calling on this radio net, I repeat, release your mic switch. You are covering me. You are covering me. Over. It stopped and Brian hit his mic switch. I hear you. I hear you. This is me. He released the switch. Roger, I have you now. The voice was very faint and breaking up. Please state your difficulty and locations and say over to signal the end of the transmission. Over. Please state my difficulty, Brian thought. God, my difficulty? I'm in a plane with a pilot he can't fly, and I don't know how to fly. Help me, help. He turned his mic off without ending the transmission properly. There was a moment's hesitation before the answer. Your signal's breaking up and I lost most of it. Understand, pilot, you can't fly, correct? Over? Brian could hardly hear him now, heard mostly noise and static. That's right, I can't fly. The plane is flying now, but I don't know how much longer. Over. Lost signal. Your location, please. Flight number, location, ver. I don't know my flight number or location. I don't know anything. I told you that. Over. He waited, but there was nothing. Once for a second, he thought he heard a break in the noise, some part of a word, but it could have been static. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 10 minutes. The plane roared and Brian listened, but heard no one. Then he hit the switch again. I don't know the flight number. My name is Brian Robeson. We left Hampton, New York, headed for the Canadian oil fields to visit my father. I don't know how to fly an airplane. And the pilot, he let go of the mic. His voice started to rattle and he felt as if he might start screaming at any second. He took a deep breath. If there's anybody listening who could help me fly a plane, answer, please. Again, he released the mic, but heard nothing but the hissing noise of the headset. After a half an hour of listening and repeating the cry for help, he tore the headset off in frustration and threw it onto the floor. It all seemed so hopeless. If he did get somebody, what could anybody do? Tell him to be careful? Also hopeless. He tried to figure out the dials again. He thought he might know which was the speed. It was a lighted number that read 160, but he didn't know if that was actual miles an hour or kilometers, or if it just meant how fast the plane was moving through the air and not over the ground. He knew airspeed was different from ground speed, but not by how much. Parts of books he read about flying came to him. How wings worked, how the propeller pulled the plane through the sky. Simple things that wouldn't help him now. Nothing could help him now. An hour passed. He picked up the headset and tried again. It was, he knew, in the end, all he had, but there was no answer. He felt like a prisoner, kept in a small cell that was hurling through the sky at what he thought to be 160 miles an hour, headed. He didn't know where. Just headed somewhere until there it was. Until what? Until he ran out of fuel? When the plane ran out of fuel, it would go down, period. Or he could pull the throttle out and make it go down now. He had seen the pilot push the throttle in to increase speed. If he pulled the throttle back out, the engine would slow down and the plane would go down. Those were his choices. He could wait for the plane to run out of gas and fall, or he could push the throttle in and make it happen sooner. If he waited for the plane to run out of fuel, he would go further. But he didn't know which way he was moving. When the pilot had jerks, he had moved the plane, but Brian couldn't remember how much or if he had come back to his original course. Since he didn't know the original course anyway, he could only guess at which display might be the compass, the one reading 342. He didn't know where he had been or where he was going, so it didn't make much difference if he went down now or waited. Everything in him rebelled against stopping the engine and falling now. He had a vague feeling that he was wrong to keep heading, as if the plane was heading, a feeling that he might be going off in the wrong direction, but he couldn't bring himself to stop the engine and fall. Now he was safe, or safer than if he went down. The plane was still flying, he was still breathing, and when the engine stopped, he would go down. So he left the plane running, holding the altitude and keep trying the radio. He worked out a system. Every 10 minutes by the small clock built into the dashboard, he tried to radio a simple message. I need help. Is there anybody listening to me? In the times between transmissions, he tried to prepare himself for what he knew was coming. When he ran out of fuel, the plane would start down. He guessed that without propeller pulling, he would have to push the nose down to keep the plane flying. He thought he might have to read that somewhere, or it just came to him. Either way, it made sense. He would have to push the nose down to keep flying speed, and then, just before he hits, he would have to pull the nose back up to slow the plane as much as possible. It all made sense. Glide down, then slow the plane and hit. He would have to find a clearing as he went down. The problem with that was that he hadn't seen one clearing since they started flying over the forest. some swamps, but they had trees scattered through them. No roads, no trails, no clearings, just the lakes. And it came to him that he would have to use a lake for landing. If he went down in the trees, he would certainly die. The trees would tear the plane into pieces as it went into them. He would have to come down in a lake. No, on the edge of a lake. He would have to come down near the edge of a lake and try to slow the plane as much as possible just before he hit the water. Easy to say, he thought, hard to do. Easy to say, hard to do. Easy to say, hard to do. It became a chant that beat with the engine. Easy to say, hard to do, impossible to do. He repeated the radio call 17 times at 10-minute intervals, working on what he would do between transmissions. Once more, he reached over to the pilot, touched him on the face, but the skin was cold, hard cold, dead cold. And Brian turned back to the dashboard. He did what he could, tightened his seatbelt, positioned himself, rehearsed mentally again and again what his procedure should be. When the plane ran out of gas, he should hold the nose down and head for the nearest lake and try to fly the plane kind of into the water. That's how he thought of it, kind of fly the plane into the water. And just before it hit, he should pull back on the wheel and slow the plane to reduce the impact. Over and over, his mind ran the picture of how it would go. The plane running out of gas, the plane flying over water, onto the water, the crash. From pictures he'd seen on TV, he tried to visualize it. He tried to be ready. But between the 17th and 18th radio transmissions, without a warning, the engine coughed and roared violently for a second and died. There was a sudden silence, cut only by the sound of the wind milling propeller and the wind past the cockpit. Brian pushed the nose of the plane down and threw up.